Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans, and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of The Making of Us, Lived Religion in America, a sub-series of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your listening fix. Iowa is lodged firmly in the American psyche as a place of traditional American values, hard work, family, and religion. Iowa is also an important player in the United States' vaunted agricultural industry, having been ranked first in the country in soybean production, corn production, and pork production. America has slowly learned also, over the past decade, with ICE raids and COVID, that a significant number of immigrants and refugees do the difficult and hazardous work of slaughtering and processing the meat products in Iowa that we purchase at our local grocery store. What is of interest to us at the National Museum of American Religion is whether religion plays important roles in the lives of these workers, and if so, how. To help us understand this, we have with us today Kristy Nabhan-Warren, professor and the inaugural VO and Elizabeth Kahl Figge Chair in Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa, and author of Meatpacking America, How Migration, Work, and Faith Unite and Divide the Heartland. Kristy received her PhD from the University of Indiana. Her research interests include American religions, ethnographic approaches to the study of religion, Catholic studies, and Latinx studies. She is committed to making scholarship meaningful to non-academics as well as academics, and prides herself on writing for a wide audience. She embraces a humanities for the public good approach to her research, writing, and dissemination of information. Kristy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
First, can you tell our listeners how you came to write this book, why you did it, and how it was done?
That's a great question, and I'll try to keep my answer short because this could take a while. So, as an ethnographer, it's always been really important to me to embed myself in a community and to really look locally and to try to understand what the national, even international story is. I think that all local stories, wherever they are, have a national, international significance. And so when I came to the University of Iowa in the fall of 2012, I was getting ready to start my third big monograph, and I really wanted to figure out what a good story was in the state of Iowa. I guess I'm very journalistic in my approach. A lot of ethnographers are. So what's the story? And so I started reading a lot of newspaper articles. I started literally driving around the state, trying to understand the geography and terrain. As a Catholic studies scholar, I knew I wanted to understand the present reality of parishes. I discovered through my initial research, that a lot of rural parishes were starting to close or consolidating various parishes into one territorial parish. And so my initial thought after having done some research is, as a Catholic studies scholar, I thought it was interesting to study rural Catholicism, rural religion, because that's been an underdeveloped area. And that was the start. Actually, the first title of this book before it became Meatpacking America was Corn Belt Catholicism. And so the initial research, this is what I love about ethnography is, you start with an idea, but then you start talking to people And you realize after you start listening to stories, usually that there's more than you as a scholar initially thought, which to me is very exciting. And so what I discovered in the course of the research, the interviews, was that yes, religion is important in Iowa. Also work. A lot of the Catholics I interviewed work at a meat processing plant. So I started with an idea of wanting to discover something about Iowa and rural Iowa in particular. And then it developed into the intersections of religion, work, and faith. And I will talk more about that with you, I'm sure, in this hour. So,
Okay. Well, you may have inspired some of our listeners, if they're young, to go into ethnography studies. That sounds very
great.
like a very fascinating thing to do. So thank you for that. You write, and you just mentioned it, that Iowa is a good place to study work, migration, and faith, or you said something similar, with work and faith being important, quote, nodes of connectivity, close quote. Can you elaborate on this, on why this is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I discovered, probably after about a year of doing research, doing ethnography, going to various parish, I was, mostly Catholic parishes for this book, but ended up interviewing people from other religious backgrounds. Yeah, I think Iowa's a really good place for that, primarily because we've got long-standing faith traditions. A big focus of my book is Catholicism. There's a long and rich history of Catholicism here, Irish, German, Czech, French, Italian. So there's a deep Catholic history. That was a real focus. But because Iowa, in the last 20, 25 years, has drawn more migrants and refugees from all over the world. And we're talking migrants, whether they're undocumented or documented, from Central America, refugees from Western, Eastern Africa, Vietnam, all over the world. And so what I discovered is that, where you have meat packing plants in big ag, so too will you have migrants from all around the world. And these migrants and refugees, not all of whom, but a vast majority of migrants and refugees to Iowa, are men and women of a deep faith, whether it's Catholic, Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Jewish, various Protestant iterations, whether that's, evangelical, Protestant, non-denominational. And so what I realized is that Iowa, as with other Midwestern places, and places where you have meatpacking states like Arkansas and North Carolina, you look at where these packing plants are and you'll see dynamic migrations and all kinds of new churches that are popping up, and mosques, because you have quite a few Muslim migrants who work at beef processing plants and chicken plants. And so I've always known that there was an intersection or a relationship between work, migration, and culture. And I think my initial interest in this whole area, well, actually, I don't think I know, was because I'm from a family of Lebanese migrants and Polish migrants from Gary, Indiana. And so I always knew, just from when I was a little kid growing up, I saw for myself hardworking people of a strong faith. In the case of my family, it was Lutheran and Catholic. And I wanted to know if that was the case in Iowa. And most certainly it is, because we have big ag, big meat packing, and we have churches that grow out of these new migrations.
Okay. Super. That's helpful. Kristy, you share early on what I think is a very significant finding in your research, that refugees, quote, draw upon their religious convictions to successfully navigate and sacralize work, close quote. How did you come to that conclusion, and what is its significance in your mind?
Yeah, thanks. It's always kind of wild to hear one's quotes being quoted back, because I feel like I'm a better writer than I am a speaker. So I'll try to speak the eloquence, and you read that very eloquently. So thank you. Yeah, and so that's kind of going back to the method of ethnography, why I think it's such an effective method, right? So as ethnographers, we're participants and we're observers, right? We listen, we observe, and we process. And so after about a year of driving around and, going to 3 different parishes, 2 in particular, one was in Columbus Junction, Iowa, St. Joseph the Worker, and one was in West Liberty, also St. Joseph, not St. Joseph the Worker. And I would just observe. And then after about a year, when folks were getting comfortable with me, I started having interviews with the blessing of the parish priest. So I started just listening of, my interlocutors' stories of their migration stories, how their faith has always helped them in their lives, how their faith has given them hope. So I understood from listening to their stories how their faith, again, it was mostly Catholic before I actually started doing field work in the meatpacking plants, how their Catholic faith, Latino and white Iowans, helped them during the migration process, whether it was a migration for their families in the 19th century, speaking of the Irish and German Catholics, or migration more recently of the Central Americans from Guatemala, Mexico, and El Salvador. So I got that the faith helped them in that process of migration and uprooting their families and then transplanting them in, eastern Iowa towns like West Liberty, Iowa, Columbus Junction, Iowa, Washington, Iowa, to name 3. And then and I heard stories about before I go to the meatpacking plant, I pray on the car ride there. Or when I'm there, I pray when I'm on the line that I don't get hurt because my family's depending on my income. Not only my family here in Iowa and in the States, but also in Mexico or Guatemala, they're depending on my income. Because Latino families are known for sending remittances. Migrants in general and refugees are well known historically, contemporarily for sending remittances to family members abroad. I mean, there are whole communities in Central America, for example, whole towns that are dependent on money from meatpacking plants and families who work in there. So it's this fascinating transnational economic networks. And so it really hit home though. So here I was, so going back to ethnography, I was listening to the stories being told to me in basement churches over many cups of coffee and casseroles and pan dulce, sweetbread. But it wasn't until I actually went to the packing plants and observed where I was really, it was such a blessing to be able to conduct research in 2 packing plants, because I was able to see again, the signing of the cross or murmurings of prayers. I was able to see lived religion, religion as it is lived in a place that we don't tend to think of as a sacred place. I mean, meatpacking plants are not sacred. They're bloody. They're violent. It's the worst smell that I've smelled in my life. It took probably 3 months to get the smell out of my hair, just being in the plants, And so I was able to see my interlocutors, the men and women who have been sharing stories about the power of their faith. And it's like, oh, light bulb went on. I really get it. Now that I'm experiencing the smells, the sights, the sounds, the bloody violence of these places, I really then understood how and why faith is so important to these men and women. Because it's one thing hearing a story when you're in the basement of a church, right? But it's another to be in a place that's crazy. It's like crazy sounds and sights. It's almost like you're in a horror movie. You're like in a horror movie and you're wondering, wow, people are living in here. How can one maintain one faith? It's like when the rubber hits the road, it's like putting one's faith to the ultimate test. And so I use a language of blessing, and I don't say that lightly, that it was a serious blessing for me as an ethnographer to have had that experience in the packing plant, because that's when I really understood lived religion, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into some of those stories later. So thank you for that overview.
Sure.
Let's jump in. So share with our listeners, if you would, Kristy, the Catholic lay of the land in Iowa in the 1930s and 40s, perhaps using the Hargroffen family and how their religion influenced their lives. You feature them in the book here, but give our listeners an understanding of this.
Yeah. So, it was really important for me, Chris, thank you for asking me that. It was really important for me writing this book. You mentioned in your lovely introduction, much of my scholarship has focused on Latino Catholics, but it was really important for me in writing this book my aim was for so a lot of people have asked me, so what did you hope the reader would come away from this book? And I would say, after really thinking about it, would be empathy. Empathy not only for the more recent migrants, the Latinos, Congolese, Sudanese, Somalians, Vietnamese, but also I wanted empathy for working class white Catholics and working class white folks who also work in these plants and who also migrated. Maybe not so much white working class in the plants today, but working class white Catholics whose predecessors were also poor, who farmed the land. They didn't have indoor plumbing. And so I try to bookend the book. So the introductory chapter and the ending chapter are both, you get Rosa in the beginning and you get Reina in the end. But then the intermittent chapters are white Catholics and Latino Catholics and Africans. And I'm trying to show, by introducing all these characters like the Hargraffens, who were Irish and Irish German family, and German and Irish Catholic family, that their lived experiences are actually at the root very similar. So I spent a lot of time, as you know from reading the book, Chris, so thank you, featuring Corinne Hargraffen, the matriarchy of the Hargraffen family, and spent a lot of time with Corinne, who is now 96 years old. She's doing great. Every year she is the matriarch in the Columbus Day parade every year. She and her family figure prominently in the homemaking chapter, because I really want to show that migrants, no matter whether we come from, and I say we because I think many of us, we assume that our ancestors came legally, quote unquote. But when we really do a lot of digging, I don't know about you all, but I know some of my Lebanese ancestors, you might have slipped through at Ellis Island, where they put eye drops in their eyes to mask if they had eye infections, right? So we all have histories of just wanting to be here to escape economic, political, religious persecution. And what I wanted to try to get across in going back and forth with the white Iowa stories and the Latino Iowa stories, for example, is to show that when people leave their homes, it's not an easy decision to make, and that families will do anything for their families to succeed. And so Corinne, she was not from a wealthy family. She and her husband, Hugh, raised their children. They were poor, but they made sure that they were clean, that they ate well, that they had, their Sunday best, was washed and laundered. Those are the same stories that I would hear from the Guatemalan mothers or the Mexican mothers I would talk to. Not having a lot of money, being really sad and missing your home and feeling detached, whether it's from Ireland, Germany, Mexico, or Guatemala, but doing your best to make a home in the United States. I didn't write the book to indict anyone. I didn't write it to indict the meatpacking industry. And I myself am a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. So I had to convince the meatpacking plant CEOs that this wasn't going to be a hit piece. It wasn't like, don't eat meat. That wasn't the message. But it was really to show that we're all related because we're all humans. How can we meet in the middle? How can we work to understand the other, especially given the climate in the United States over the last 10 years, in particular towards newcomers? I know that was a long answer, but
No, you have lots of good things to say.
passionate about it.
Let me ask this. I have two questions coming out of that. One, can you give our listeners a sense of how Catholicism was woven into the tapestry of the Hargraffen family?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I wish I could bring you all into Corinne's kitchen table and for you all to have a cup of coffee with her and a slice of her homemade pie. But I'll try to do my best right here. You see it visiting Corinne's house. You see little signs on the wall. You see the Knights of Columbus calendar hanging in the kitchen. You'll see a rosary on the counter. You'll see a crucifix hanging on the wall, right? You'll see a medallion of the Blessed Mother that, that Corinne and family members wear. You see it you hear it in the way they talk about being, because they're a farm family. So this is not a family who worked in the meatpacking plant. You hear it in the way they talk about the land and talk about wanting to be good stewards of the land and talk about how their Catholic spirituality and their Catholic ethos on the environment. This is well before Laudato Si, right? Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment. There's a deep environmental strain in the way a lot of rural Iowa Catholics talk about the land, and that's something I probably honestly could have unpacked even more in the book. But, talking with Corinne, talking with her daughter, Lois, the way Lois talks about the land, and she and her now deceased husband, Tim, it's in their language, it's in their lexicon, it's in the material items that are in their homes, it's in the foods that they eat. They breathe it, they eat it, and they live it. And I think that, I know I keep bringing up the term lived religion, but for me, the approach to the study of religion that we call lived religion is so important, because most people don't live out their faith on Sundays or Friday nights. It's not just in one place, right? It's all throughout their lives. And so one of the things that I was really curious about exploring when I was doing the research for this book was, how do Iowans, whether they're brown, black, or white, or Asian, how do they live religion in their everyday lives? So I did make the assumption that they did, and I found out that they do. And so,
Okay.
and one of the ways is definitely food. I mean, wow. You hear a lot about casseroles with marshmallows, some without marshmallows. Yes. I think I gained 10 pounds writing this book because I ate a lot of Midwestern food and drank a lot of coffee. That's part of living out Catholic faith too, in Iowa. So.
Right. Can you give us a sentence or two maximum on answering this question? You talk about racism. Everybody, from what you say, and I think the observation is probably true, deals with this in some way, right? Individuals deal with how to deal with people who are different than them.
Yeah.
And that may be color of their skin. How did religion animate their approach to that topic? Was religion in the racism, and was religion in the fight against racism for each individual? How did you see that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'll try to keep my answer short. I've brought this particular vignette that I'm going to share with you in a second when I've given various talks at universities, and actually with a lot of community groups and book clubs who have been reading, Catholic book clubs who have been reading the book. One example that really, ethnographic vignette that I can really recall right now very vividly, was one morning. So the English language mass at St. Joseph the Worker in Columbus Junction was before the Spanish language mass. So there would be about 45 minutes in between, where the white Catholics, mostly white Catholics, so they're very separate. They're very separate spaces. The white Catholics would go downstairs, eat, have coffee, and then after this, and then clean up. And then after the Spanish language mass, it's mostly the Latinos would come downstairs and do the same thing. There's not a lot of intermixing with the two groups, which I found it saddened me, to be honest with you. And I think that actually this is pretty common in the Midwest, where especially rural parishes are not very integrated. And the numbers of Latinos at the Spanish language mass was much, much larger, 5 times as large, maybe 6 times as large as the white folks at the English language mass. So an example that brings up the struggle here, how it's a vexed relationship, I would say, is I was having coffee and recovering from probably a food coma that I just had, talking with a group of ladies I'd gotten, white ladies, and we, asking them about their kids and just talking about, and one of the moms I remember was talking about how she's really worried about her daughter and just, she has a lot of pressures being a working mom. One of my friends, Spanish-speaking friends from the second mass came down, and I switched over into Spanish, and we were talking and we gave hugs. The table of the white ladies got completely silent. And I don't know if they had heard me speak Spanish before or what, but they just looked at me, they looked at her, And it was just like, you hear of the stink eye and like the side eye. We got my Latina friend, I got a serious side eye from the white ladies who just didn't know what to make. And then I said goodbye to my friend. She went back upstairs to the Spanish language mass, and I went back and sat down, and the whole mood shifted. They literally kind of moved away from me a little bit. Like, so who are you? Like, who are you vibing with? And so I realized, I'm like, oh, so I code switched. I code switched from English to Spanish. I code switched from one group to the other. A lot of these white Iowans struggle at code switching. Very few of them speak Spanish. And that's something that I write about in the book that I think would be an elegant solution. It would take work on the part of white Iowans to actually take some time to learn Spanish, because like it or not, Spanish speaking folks, whether they're Catholic or not, are working in the packing plants, they're candling eggs, they're working in the fields, they're farming for a lot of these white Catholics, white Iowans who own the farms. And so, for their part, the Spanish-speaking Catholics are learning English. And you'll see more Spanish-speaking Catholics going to the English-speaking Mass. But you'll only see one, maybe two English-speaking Catholics, white Catholics, going to the Spanish language Mass. I was always one, the gringa. And then there was usually my friend Jenny, she and her daughters, because she really wanted to learn Spanish and she wanted her daughters to learn Spanish. But, it's been a little while since I've been embedded in the field work. My hopes is that that's getting better, but I'm just not sure, because I haven't been in the field for a bit now.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's jump ahead from that mid-20th century Catholic tapestry to the early 21st century. And in your book, you write that, quote, "The Corn Belt can be an evocative conceptual tool to reimagine and rework American religious histories and sociologies," close quote. Please tell our listeners what you mean, perhaps through the stories of Father Sia and Abby, a second-generation Latina.
Yeah. That's so funny that you bring that quote up, because as I told you all earlier, the title of the book was originally Corn Belt Catholicism, and that was going to be an even bigger framework, I think, than it ended up becoming. But I was thinking about, when we think of corn and we think about landscape and we think about Iowa, we think corn, we think hogs, and I was thinking a lot about, as I was writing this book, and I was in a lot of workshopping various chapters before the book came out. And it was a group of sociologists of religion who really encouraged me to do this, to really think about conceptualizing American religious history more deeply through the lens of sort of the Corn Belt. And so I was thinking a lot about how place, how geography, and I'm not a geographer, so just full disclosure, I'm not a geographer. And I'm actually, so I'm not a geographer. That's not my training. But as American religious historians, when we think about religion, and we talk a lot about the landscape, but we talk about that really broadly. So I got to thinking, well, what if we actually really did invoke the landscape? I mean, everywhere you look in Iowa, there's corn or there's soybeans. And the very people I was interviewing worked with corn in its lifespan in some capacity, whether they're working for Cargill seeds, or they're planting the seeds in their fields, or they're slaughtering the cattle at Iowa Premium Beef, or the hogs that are also corn-fed at Tyson. Everyone is connected to corn in some way. Everyone's eating it. Everyone's ingesting it. I think I read a statistic at some point, Chris, that where there's a pretty high percentage of our bodies that corn is in our bodies, especially for Iowans. I don't have that stat right now. Corn even sweats apparently in the summer. One of the things I had to get used to was the humidity in Iowa in the summer. I don't do very well with humidity, and apparently corn sweats. So even in Iowa, people are sweating alongside the corn, and they're imbibing the corn sweat. So I was just thinking a lot about how the geography and the terrain actually shapes religion as well. And so an example of that would be the Knights of Columbus chapter, in Columbus Junction. It's all Latino men, And every year they have a big tamale fundraiser. I'm telling you what, the best tamales ever. They even have vegetarian ones. They're delicious. Thinking about it, right? Corn, masa, the corn. So as the Knights of Columbus, men and women are making it, they're touching the corn, they're eating the corn. It's part of them. And then I was thinking about corn as a host and as sort of the body and blood of Christ. And so I think when we think about corn on so many levels, it's geographic, it's symbolic. So many Latinos are farm workers, I think when we tell the stories of religion in America, I think more and more we need to start thinking about the land and how the geography influences the shape religion takes in that area.
That's very interesting. I think worth thinking about, definitely, as you observe the nation from 30,000 feet and look at religions and their geography. You might get some interesting and helpful stories that are illustrative of religion in America. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
In your brilliantly entitled chapter, The Work of God and Hogs, you write about Maurice, Benita, and All Nations Baptist Church. Would you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, Maurice. Yes, I'm glad you liked that title. Thanks. That's one that they let me keep. Maurice is such a compelling man. He and his family. I got to know he and his wife Benita really well. They live in Iowa City, so a lot of the workers who work at Tyson, especially the African workers, Congolese, Sudanese. Maurice is Congolese. He's evangelical Christian. He goes to a church literally right up the street from my house, which I visited a couple of times. All Nations and it's really multi-denominational. I mean, it's Christian, but it's basically, the few times I've gone there, I mean, it's African and Latino and Pan-Asian. And so Maurice is such a, I'm so glad you asked about Maurice, because he worked his way up in Tyson, and he's a translator and he's a provider, and he and his wife now have 4 sons. He shared a lot with me over coffee. One of the times we had coffee at a local coffee shop right up the street, of just about how difficult the work was on his body, and how his wife would rub ointments on his hands, Benita, and just like how he smelled when he'd come home, and just how he felt so awful, and how he never wanted his beautiful wife with beautiful hands working in the meatpacking plant. He didn't want her to ruin her hands, and she ended up becoming a nurse. So she uses her hands and she can still get her manicures and everything. But what I loved about Maurice working with him is that he was so forthright about his faith, and he's very involved in his church. Even since the book came out, he's really high up in the church now. He's a really great example of someone who would never say, and this is a point that I make in the book, that none of the migrants and refugees I interviewed would say that Tyson or Iowa premium beef those are sacred places. But they were trying to infuse these places with a little bit of sacrality when they were at work, because these are such profane places. And I think Maurice, the example of Maurice was the stories that he shared with me and that I include in the book. He included a lot of what he does to maintain his soul. He prays a lot. He goes to church with his family. He, tries to be a great worker. He tries to bring the love of Christ with him when he's at work. I mean, he's really the living embodiment of Christianity at work. And it was just really a real privilege to get to know him and his wife. And we've actually had coffee since. Actually, they just live right up the street from me, actually. So there's Pheasant Ridge in Iowa City. A lot of African refugees live there, many of whom have become citizens. And the west side of Iowa City, interestingly enough, there are a lot of workers at Tyson and Iowa premium beef, actually, who live and who carpool to these various places. So,
okay. All right. Thank you. We are talking with Kristy Nabhan-Warren, professor in the inaugural VO and Elizabeth Kahl Figge Chair in Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa, and author of Meatpacking America, How Migration, Work, and Faith Unite and Divide the Heartland. Listeners, again, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Kristy, in this same brilliantly entitled chapter, you write, quote, as Americans have shifted from mainstream denominational affiliations, think Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist, in recent years, enterprising corporations have taken advantage of the spiritual but not religious identifying landscape in the United States and have rebranded their workplaces as religious sites, close quote. Can you tell us a little bit about this movement and what you have found on the ground and its meaning?
Yeah. Boy, I could talk for hours about this, but I won't, obviously. So this is, again, I know I keep going back to the method of ethnography, but this is something that really surprised me. So when I went into this, I really wanted to understand everyday Catholics, how they live their faith, and then how they live their faith in meatpacking plant. And then what I didn't expect to find out was that, at least at the two plants where I did my field work, Tyson and Columbus Junction and Iowa Premium Beef in Tama, Iowa, and I've since found out at other plants as well, Tyson plants around the country, is that the upper management, which is almost all white in most of these, white men and women at these plants, or upper middle class, also are deeply religious people and use what I say I call a religious lexicon. And so whether we're talking about the Tyson plant in Columbus Junction or in Waterloo, Iowa, or in Arkansas or in North Carolina, with Tyson, there's a chaplaincy program. So every single plant, whether it's chicken, pork, or beef, Tyson, there is a chaplain whose job is to minister to the spirituality of the workers, also driving injured workers to the physicians. It's kind of a jack of all trades kind of position, but it all supposedly stems from their spiritual guidance. And so that was a surprise. I had no idea that Tyson, and it has the largest chaplaincy program of any company globally. And so the CEOs, CFOs of these companies take religion very seriously. I have been trained as a scholar. There's a phrase that we use, hermeneutic of suspicion. I've always wrestled with that phrase a little bit. I prefer to use the language of hermeneutic of curiosity. So with using a hermeneutic of curiosity, I set out to understand, what was going on here, and were other scholars writing about this? Turns out there are quite a few scholars, mostly sociologists, writing about religion at work. So there have been some really good sociologies of, like, Wall Street, for example. It's there by Karen Ho. It's called Liquidated. It's through Duke University Press. Carolyn Chen wrote a really good book on Silicon Valley. I'm blanking on the title. She's also a sociologist. I think she's at USC, on Silicon Valley and how it's using sort of Eastern spirituality to maximize profits. And so both of these ethnographies by sociologists are really focused on ethnography from the top down, and how the CEOs and CFOs are really trying to maximize profits by using the veneer of spirituality. So in my book, I do both ethnography from the bottom up. That's really, I think, more of the focus of Meatpacking America, where everyday workers. But I also thought it was important to do ethnography, quote unquote, from the top down. And again, that's not something I had planned on doing, but I ended up spending a lot of time on it. So I spent a lot of time at Iowa Premium Beef, shadowing the various heads of the various departments of the packing plant. And also at Tyson, I spent a lot of time with the human resources manager. And it was fascinating, troubling, vexing. I don't know, just like I had a lot of complex reactions to how these companies are using religious language. On the one hand, I want to believe that they mean what they say, that we want to be good stewards, we care, these are our family members. we want to set a good example. They use thinly veiled evangelical, usually language. But right around when the book was coming out, and I think I'm pretty generous to the CEO, CFOs in the book. I give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm critical, but not like, I think I mostly give them the benefit of the doubt that they are really doing what they say that they want to do. But after COVID hit, we found out that these plants and the managers of most of these plants really were not being good stewards. They were not treating the Latinos and Africans and working class whites on the line like family. And if that's the way you treat family, I've said in many public presentations, then to me, that's not acceptable. And so since the book has come out, I've written some public facing pieces on how on how these companies really did let their workers down. Many workers got sick, many died because the protections were not in place, that if the CEOs and CFOs were good stewards and truly cared and were following their religious convictions, one could say that they would have done a better job. And so I think in pieces that have come out since the book, I have been more critical of these corporations.
Okay. That also is a story unto itself, probably.
It is a
book
story.
even.
And I'm trying to be very diplomatic here.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah.
Would you share the story of religion's role in the lives of Fidencio and Catalina, including the significance for them of posada, and include a definition of that religious term?
So, okay, the posada is when Mary. So you have an annual, for those of y'all listeners who don't know, December 12th is a really big time for Latino Catholics because it celebrates the Virgin of Guadalupe, her apparitions to Juan Diego, who's been sainted, and the Virgin of Guadalupe has been recognized as the patroness of the Americas. So I have long gone to celebrations of the Virgin of Guadalupe because I've just been fascinated with the love and support that Latinos have for her and see her as, an uber mother figure and someone to look up to as Jesus's mother, as Christ's mother. And so I really got to know the couple you mentioned, Fidencio and Catalina, when I was going to St. Joseph's and I was, going to the Virgin of Guadalupe. And I think that the posadas are basically, it's a celebration. It's a religious celebration. It's symbolic of Mary and Joseph's going door to door, trying to find room at the inn. And I remember Catalina and Fidencio were saying, yeah, that's like us, because like we're not really accepted in this country. We're one paycheck away from losing our trailer. And so in many ways, public processions like the one that Columbus Junction has, St. Joseph has for the Virgin of Guadalupe, is very much, I don't want to say public theater, it's that, but it's very much enacting the everyday lives and struggles of Latinos in the United States. And you could say the same, I don't have this in the book, but you could say the same for the Way of the Cross, the Via Crucis, during Holy Week before Easter. In many Latino communities, the Via Crucis, the Way of the Cross, is also deeply symbolic and profound. Like there's one in Pilsen, Chicago every year that my colleague, Mary Karen Davalos, has written really eloquently about. That procession has a deep meaning for Latinos as well, because the stops along that procession are in front of like factories where migrants have been treated poorly, or places where migrants have died. And so these are public processions that have a real deep meaning. And so it's where sort of like biblical realities and stories come head to head, face to face with the everyday realities that poor Latinos face in the United States.
Okay. All right. Well, that was good school lesson on that. I didn't really know much about about Posada at all. So I'm sure some of our listeners haven't as well. So thank you. Would you briefly share some stories of how the old-timer Irish Catholics of Iowa and the new immigrant Catholics of Iowa are engaging and interacting with each other? Now, you gave us a snippet there with the church basement story, but I think there's more that you might want to share.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I've thought a lot about this. This is something that I remain really interested in. Like how, I guess the question I have now is, and I have some questions at the end of the book, or I have some challenges, I guess, for religious communities, and I have some advice for how communities can do better. And I think that it takes a priest. I think for the priest in the leadership position, speaking of Catholicism, has to be a really strong leader, but also really walks a tightrope. Like Father Joseph at St. Joseph, he's no longer there. He's now in Ottumwa, in a Spanish-speaking parish, so he's been moved around quite a bit. He shared with me many times about he used the language of schizophrenic. He said being a priest in this kind of parish, he goes, I feel schizophrenic because I have to keep the white Catholics happy. They're the ones who are giving the money, but the reality is that it's a Latino parish, and that's what's growing. And the white Catholics are, quite honestly, oftentimes threatened by the newer comers in their minds, who are benefiting from their economic largesse. And so Father Joseph talked about this at length with me, how he was always walking a tightrope, because clearly the writings on the wall is that the future is Latino for Catholic parishes in the United States, right? The future is Latino. And increasingly in some places, Congolese. Like here in Iowa City, we've got a rising number of Congolese Catholics. Downtown at St. Mary's, there's a French language mass, actually. So the future isn't so much white Catholics. The future is, brown and Black. And that's really hard for white Catholics, much as it is for most Americans, right? Most white Americans, as we're seeing, right? Struggling with the newer immigrations and migrations. And so in my experience, it takes a leader who's willing to say things, but also to get backlash, right? Father Bernie is an example. Father Bernie, I do include Father Bernie in the book. He is the parish priest in Washington, Iowa, which, unlike Columbus Junction, which is a processing town, that's where Tyson is, Washington is what we can call a producer town. It's much wealthier than Columbus Junction. That's where the animals are raised, primarily hogs. It's the hog capital of Iowa and really the Midwest in this tiny county, Washington County. And so it's a wealthier county. Also, large numbers of Latinos. It's also, I think it's a Latino close to becoming a minority majority, but I'm not sure if it'll reach that because of the fact that it's a producer town. Father Bernie's done a really good job being a mediator between the white and the Latino communities. And I think one of the things that he's done well, is he's put Latina women in positions of leadership in his parish. And so I think there are real challenges for parishes in any religious community to overcome. But I think it takes a strong leader, a leader that's willing to take some backlash, a leader who promotes from within, who does a lot of mediation work. I've thought about this a lot too, and I don't know if it's been done or not in parishes, but having like reconciliation workshops, kind of like healing workshops. But I think that I'm hopeful about the future of parishes, because I think when it comes down to it, for many of these parishes to cease to exist, when we're talking about Catholics, there has to be a recognition and an embrace of it being a multi-ethnic space, or else it's just not going to exist. I do think that priests today and religious leaders have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of reconciliation work to do and bringing people together. I think that work can be done, but I'm hopeful. And there's a lot of ethnographers I know. I can give you names of other people to interview. Susan Reynolds would be one. Susan is a good friend of mine. She teaches at Emory, and she has a beautiful book out based on her dissertation on a Catholic parish in Roxbury, where the parish priest there, it's a truly multi-ethnic, multiracial space. And so it seems like that they figured out the secret sauce there. And I've asked Susan, like, can you get this priest to go on the road, if you will, to give advice to other parishes? So some places are doing an excellent job, other places aren't, but I do think it takes a really good leader.
Okay.
That's a very long answer. I apologize.
No, you have lots of very, very helpful information for our listeners. So in my book, the longer, the better. Okay. Let's see. You wrote about James, a refugee from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who is now employed by Iowa Premium Beef.
Yeah.
Can you share with our listeners the role that religion played in his life and plays, including at the refugee camp in the DRC and in Cedar Rapids?
Yeah. James, I'm going to try to say his name, Mugerke. He and his family, yes, lived in the DRC, and then he was in a refugee camp. So what I try to do is open every chapter with a powerful vignette of someone who's come to the United States. Yeah, this is in the Cattle Steered by Faith. James credits, he's a Jehovah's Witness. He credits his faith for getting him through. And it's interesting too, not only, so he became Jehovah's Witness, through encounters with witnesses in the refugee camp. And what's so fascinating to me is, as I was gathering all these stories of faith and migration, is that so many of these religions, a lot of interdenominational and interfaith cooperation. So you had Jehovah's Witnesses, various kingdom halls coming together with Catholic Church Charities and the U.S. government, all coming together to bring James and his family to the United States as refugees. And so this is a story this is something that I'd love to see more scholars get into, is how, so there's a lot of things that go on in the background, right? So you've got, various religions working together. You've got Lutherans, you've got Methodists, you've got Baptists, you've got Mormons, you have, LDS, you have, Jehovah's Witnesses, all working together, sometimes against each other. But what I'm seeing is more cooperation in trying to work to get families over to the United States and co-sponsoring. And so James and his family were officially sponsored by Catholic Church Charity, but they were Jehovah's Witnesses, right? And so that's something that there's all kinds of, when you do research, any kind of research, whether it's historical, sociological, ethnographic, you're surprised. And that was another area of surprise for me. I don't think fully grasped the level of interfaith cooperation. And so that was really exciting for me to learn that. And also kind of to venture out from James being a Jehovah's Witness, he and his family being sponsored by Catholics. One of the things that I learned from Father Joseph is that, in the town of Columbus Junction, as well as in a lot of rural areas in Iowa, the various churches work together, not only to bring, migrants and refugees over, but to work to provide food, to work on a path to citizenship. It doesn't stop once they bring folks over, help sponsor. The work is really only beginning. And so that was just really heartening, because I think, we hear so many negative things in the news, and we hear about xenophobia, we hear about racism, we hear about all those things, right, that are true. And I don't want to say that those things aren't happening on a meta level, because they are. But what we don't always hear about are all of these other nonprofits and other organizations working together to do works of mercy, to follow the Beatitudes, to be really informed as they see by biblical, asks that they do these things. And so that that was one of the heartening things, meeting James and hearing about his story and hearing about how these religious groups, which have not always gotten along, right, who have very deeply ingrained theological differences, right? But they work together for the greater good of helping
Right.
people.
That's a very positive story. Absolutely. You make a distinction, Kristy, about the, quote, religion and work of the producers, close quote, and, quote, religion and the work of the processors, close quote. It seems to be significant. You talked about it briefly, I think, a few minutes ago, but would you share this finding with our listeners and any additional details that might be helpful to them?
Yeah. I mean, I'm blanking on my colleagues' names right now, but I've got some colleagues at the university, Indiana University, which is my alma mater, who are sociologists, and they've done some really great work. I'm blanking on their name right now. Sociology department there. They've done some really interesting work on meatpacking plant towns, slaughterhouse towns, and what they call, racialized capitalism, and how processing towns are places where racialized capitalism is really taking place within the closed doors of the plants, right? And when you go inside a plant, you'll mostly see brown and black men and women on the line doing the really difficult work, the very occasional white working class person on the line. And so that kind of ethos really pervades the town. And so Columbus Junction, that's where Tyson Processing is. Tyson is a huge employer. Pretty much everyone who lives and works in Tyson, if you're a Latino, you work for Tyson. And that kind of ethos of being a processing town, racialized capitalism, really pervades the mentality of the town, right? When you go over to Washington, which I mentioned briefly earlier, is much wealthier. That's where the hogs are raised. The hogs from Washington County and the small city of Washington make their way to the Tyson plant. And so processing towns are wealthier, they're whiter, they don't have this, they do smell from the hogs, from the CAFOs, they do. The CAFOs are the confined animal feeding operations where the hogs, so there is a smell, but they don't have the kind of stigma. Washington, there's very much like a class thing going on here where you've got, like Washington's more sort of considered upper middle class. It's whiter. It's considered classier. That's where the hogs are raised. It's considered a cleaner town. Even the language that's used to describe Washington versus Columbus Junction is very racialized, right? But Washington kind of smells bad too because you have all the CAFOs there and you have all the hog waste. But when you get to Columbus Junction, it's visibly a poorer place. It's struggling in ways that Washington isn't. And it's where I would argue racialized capitalism is really in overdrive. And I don't know if I really use that terminology in the book so much because these scholars approached me after the book came out. But I would say that racialized capitalism is very much in play in Washington, in the CAFOs, in the egg handling, but it's very much alive inside and very hidden. It's hidden inside the meatpacking plant.
What about what's the difference? What does religion look like in Washington, and what does religion look like in the processing city? Are there differences that you can?
No, I think that's you know what? That's a really good question, Chris. Similarities in the sense that the Catholic churches in both places are really thriving. Religion, official religion, organized religion is thriving in both places for sure. Church attendance is really high. The Tamale Sundays are well attended. It's religion is very alive and well. But I would say, I should have thought about this, had my answer more prepared. The role of religion, I think, takes on a different kind of intensity in Columbus Junction because that's where the dangerous work is being done. Working in a hog confined animal feeding operation is really smelly. It's not that it's not dangerous, but it's not dangerous in the way that working in a meatpacking plant is. So I would say that religion is literally on the line, with the line workers, right? So when I was at the Tyson plant, I can give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about theoretically here, was that I would see workers make the sign of the cross. I would see like some of the Latino Catholics I know with tattoos touching their backs or their forearms where they had tattoos. So there's a lot of like tactileness in the plant, like, or like wearing a scapular, a Catholic Latino working wearing a scapular on the line. There was a lot of like reminders on, like materiality, like the touching and the praying on the line in ways that I think, it's not that it's not in Washington, but there's a kind of intensity and urgency that religion takes when you're in a dangerous place like the meatpacking plant.
Right. And probably religion takes on an intensity when you're economically not well off, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And for our listeners and for me as well, you say touching their tattoos. Is that some sort of religious tattoo they're touching? Is that part of their religious practice? And the scapula, tell us about that.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I shouldn't have assumed. So a scapular, you can date these back to medieval Catholicism. So it's like a little ribbon, and there's two little pieces of felt material. And usually, sometimes there's an image of the Virgin Mary, sometimes Jesus Christ, sometimes the host and the chalice and Jesus. But it's a physical, Catholics are very into materiality. And so having physical reminders on their bodies to remind them of their faith. So they literally wear their faith. And so many of the Latino men in particular I interviewed wore scapulars around their necks, underneath their clothes. You wear it underneath your shirt and underneath the frock that you put on. So it's the close, it's on your skin. You're wearing it on your skin. Tattoos of the Virgin Guadalupe were common among the Latino Catholics on their back, on their forearms. Sometimes Jesus. I'd say the tattoos of the Virgin were a little more predominant. So there's a lot of materiality in all religions, I think. But I think with Catholics, you've got the Virgin of Guadalupe, you've got Jesus Christ, you've got crucifixes, and you've got scapulars, and then you've got the making the sign of the cross. Up, down, left, right. Those were, I saw quite a bit of that when I was, those religious acts when I was in the packing plant.
Okay. Let's see. We have about, let's say, 10 more minutes. So let's get to the last questions. I might go quickly through some or skip one or two, but let's see. Kristy, you spent some time in the Iowa premium beef plant, as you said earlier, when you were talking about chaplains in companies. What did you learn regarding religion and the company and religion and the workers? I mean, can you give us a few examples of what you saw chaplains doing in the plant? One or two examples of religious behavior, religious workings that they were doing.
Yeah, the chaplains. Yeah. Well, Iowa premium beef doesn't have a chaplain. And it was really interesting because I went there and spent a lot of time there after I was at Tyson. And there was a little bit of competitiveness there. And they were like, well, because I asked if they had a chaplaincy. And they're like, well, we don't have a chaplain because we don't want to privilege any one religion like Tyson does, So there was a little bit of, and so at Iowa premium beef, in their, in their handbook, for example, Muslims. There's a growing number of Muslim workers at Iowa Premium Beef, and it's also a halal plant. So halal meat is meat that's been killed a certain way, that where Muslims can, it's like the ultimate, it's like the highest level of approval, much like kosher. Similar, but not exactly different. And so I remember I was in the break room, just kind of observing, talking to some folks, and I saw a small group of African Muslim women, Sudanese, who had their prayer rugs rolled up in the corner, and they had a little like shower curtain area, like a little curtain that they drew where they could do the call to prayers. And I saw them pray. And I saw them before they performed the call to prayer, they washed their face, washed their hands, and performed ablutions. And I chatted with the ladies a little bit, and then I chatted with human resources about it. And the human resources said, yeah, we're comfortable with our workers taking breaks to pray and to do what they need to do. They just need to get approval from their line shift manager. And so at Iowa Premium Beef, they want to respect world religions. They don't want to privilege any one religion over another, as long as it doesn't interfere with the line, with the processing. And I have to say, I was very moved by seeing these women, because it's hard to imagine, but I try to describe in the book as well as I can how greasy and just gross these plants are. No matter how much they're cleaned, there's always a layer of fat in the, of grease in the break room. It always smells. And the fact that these women were able to enter a sacred space and pray to Mecca amidst, in this place, right, where animals are being slaughtered and cut and killed, was pretty astounding to me, right? And so that was a role that you would ask specifically about the chaplain, but that was a really powerful image of religion at work. Now, Joe Blay, who for a long time was the chaplain, he's Ghanaian American. He's no longer at the Tyson plant, but when he was there, when I did my field work, he would regularly walk on the line, talking to folks. He would eat lunch with workers. He would have like office hours where workers, when they were on break, could come talk to him about spiritual concerns. He even told me that he married some folks who met at Tyson. He was invited to a lot of baby showers. And so Joe performed a lot of duties of a pastor and then some, so kind of like a combo: office hours, visiting folks on the line without disrupting the work, lest they lose their focus. So I learned a lot from Joe about what a chaplain does at Tyson. So.
Okay. Yes, thank you for that. I think I confused or combined two of my questions. One was about chaplain work, and the other was about just religion itself and what you saw there. Before we move on to the last two or three questions, is there any other, where else did you see religion at work in your plant visits? Do you have another story or two?
Oh gosh, and there's a lot.
And one, I'll prompt you on one.
Tell me. I'm blanking right now.
You were with quality assurance supervisors Raul and Edith, and you were on the kill floor.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And you wrote, quote, "Our eyes met and we all bowed our heads out of respect. It felt like a holy moment," close quote. Elaborate here a little bit. I mean, it's hard to imagine a holy moment on a kill floor, but at the same time, I sort of understand what you're saying. Give us an insider's look at what was going on here religiously.
Yeah, thanks for that. So as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the Iowa Premium Beef, I was there for a whole week. I stayed in a motel up the street, and I was there like all day, each day that day. And I was able to see the slaughter process, what they call the hot box. And so I was up in this little platform with two employees of Tyson. And we looked at each other, bowed our heads. And for me, it felt like a holy moment. Then I talked with them afterward, and they both talked about how they struggle with the killing, even though they know that the animal is feeding. And they talked about their own spirituality and how they believe that animals have souls. So we got into a conversation about animals and whether or not they have souls, and both of them were raised Catholic. And so it led to a really deep conversation about, how human animals and non-human animals are related, and the purpose of killing, where these animals go once they've been killed. I initially thought of writing solemn moment, but I thought, it actually felt holy in a way. And there's a famous philosopher of religion, French, named René Girard, who's written a lot about violence and the sacred. And so I was thinking about his work as I was doing field work in here. And if you think about like biblical texts, there's a lot of blood and there's a lot of violence, in the Bible. And I was thinking a lot about, when I was thinking about that moment, that ethnographic moment, about how I felt called to like pray for this animal as they did too. I mean, and I always feel as an author, I'm a religious studies scholar, but I was also raised in the Lutheran Church. And even though I'm not really practicing anymore, I always want to tell my readers where I'm coming from as an author and as a person. And so I got into some deep discussions with, Raul in particular about how we were raised and how we reconcile violence and death. And so, yeah, I wouldn't have thought, again, here was another surprising moment in the ethnography where I just felt like I needed to have a silent prayer for this animal and also for the people charged with doing this job, because I can't imagine doing that as my job. So yeah, I mean, I'll send this to you, Chris. I have a chapter coming out in an edited volume any day now, actually. It's a collection on existentialist anthropology by anthropologists of religion, where we really talk about um, our own sort of like selves and doing the work. So I really unpack that moment a lot more in this
Okay.
chapter and say a lot more about the blood and the violence and my own response to it. So I'll send that. That will give a more eloquent answer than I just gave to you. So
Okay. I'd appreciate that. Thank
yeah.
you. Okay. Second to last question. Kristy, would you tell us about Raina, the Pentecostal church she belongs to, and how this helps her?
Yeah. So I ended the story with Arena, and that's not her real name because she is undocumented. And so, for those of you who haven't read the book, this is a thing in ethnography where sometimes individuals want to be named, and so you get their permission. And so but if someone is undocumented, I ask them to choose a pseudonym or another name, and this woman chose Arena. And Arena, I got to know because our her two of her kids go to school with two of my kids, and that's how I got to know her. And it kind of started out where I would drive one of her sons to music practice, and I became kind of like an Uber driver for the family. When I was able to drive them to the mall, they love going to the mall, El Mall. I would now they have cars and they're. But when she and her family were fairly new to coming to the United States. Actually, this is after her husband was deported. That's a whole other long story. But I became friends with Reina and her children, and worked with the Catholic Worker House to help get them situated. They lived at the Catholic Worker House for a while. Then they were moved. They got their own apartment. And this is another example of interfaith cooperation where you had Catholics working with Unitarian Universalists, working with the United Church of Christ, working with agnostics like myself, who I work closely with the Catholic Worker House just as a volunteer. And so it was really heartening for me to see all these different agencies and women working to support this family to make sure that Reina's children were successful in school, that they had clothes, that the youngest daughter at the time was going to Head Start preschool so that Reina could get a job because she ended up getting her work permit. And so I became friends with her first. And, it's a really tricky thing when you're working with someone who's not undocumented. You can't just go in there and say, hey, can you tell me your story? And so again, a huge part of ethnography, the method is relationship building. And I think for me, that was just a beautiful part of the research process, is getting to know Reina. And actually, I wasn't even sure if I was going to include Reina in the book. And she really wanted me to include her because I was like, oh, I've known you for a while, but, we never want this to seem transactional, that you're
Right.
friends with somebody to put them in your book for your research, but I thought it was I'd mentioned earlier that the first chapter is on coming to the United States. And so I have Rosa's story, another undocumented Latina coming. And then Arena, I wanted to end the book with someone who's decided to stay. And Arena, rather than join her husband and return to Guatemala, she wanted to stay here and raise her kids because she said even though she was apart from her husband and that was incredibly painful, she wanted to raise her children here because they had a lot more opportunities. And so, again, I think going back to something I shared earlier and trying to get the reader, even if they want to build a wall, if they're for a wall or they're anti, I may not change hearts and minds through this book, but I wanted to at least try to share a mother's perspective on, I don't want my children to go home where they're not going to have enough food and they're not going to have good education. Although, she misses her home, Los Estados Unidos has become her home, and Iowa in particular. And so I'm just hoping, I wanted to end that chapter with Reina's story, to basically get the reader to think like, yeah, wow. Because most of us, white Americans, of my generation, we have not had to make that decision to leave our homes to go somewhere else that we didn't know. I'm really grateful that I've never had to make that decision. Right. And so I just, again, wanted to end on putting ourselves in someone else's shoes kind of thing. So that's why I chose to end with her. And she's just a really compelling person. Yeah.
Can you give us a really brief insight into the Pentecostal church that she belongs to, and the role that and her faith plays in her staying?
Yeah. So for Reina, and that's the interesting thing too, which I haven't talked a lot about. For many migrants, their faith becomes even stronger once they come to the United States, right? Where they may not have been, regular attendees at their village church in Guatemala, somewhere in Central America, in the United States. It's a hub, right? You meet other migrants, you meet other Guatemalans, maybe of the same dialect. In this case, Canjabal, that is her village dialect. It's like a social service agency. It's a place to get a meal. It's a place, the pastors of these churches will pick, like Reina, before Reina had a car, a dependable car, the pastor and his wife would pick up Reina and her children and take them to church, right? And so it's much like any, for many folks, it's a place where you feel seen and heard, where you can get a meal, where and in her case, where she might not feel so alone, because for a while she was pretty isolated without a car, and she was able to get bus passes before she got a car from our friends at the Catholic Worker House. But the church is really a lifeline and remains a lifeline for her and her family to feel like they belong, to feel like they're not alone, that there are other Spanish-speaking, Canjabal-speaking women and men like them, So yeah, I would say the church, much like for Maurice, the All Nations Church, because at work, they're surrounded by other Africans and Latinos, but walking around in the streets of Iowa City or anywhere else, it's like a pretty white space, but in church. And that's the interesting thing too, right? The meatpacking plants, much like the churches, right, that these migrants go to, are very interethnic, interracial, which is not necessarily par for the course of mainstream Iowa, right?
Right.
And so that's where the church functions very much like the meatpacking plant, is you're surrounded by your people.
Okay. Well, in interest of time, let's wrap this up so you can get to your next appointment. We have been talking with Kristy Nabhan-Warren, professor in the inaugural V.O. and Elizabeth Kahl Figge Chair in Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa, and author of Meatpacking America, How Migration, Work, and Faith Unite and Divide the Heartland. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fix. And if you enjoyed this episode, please write a review. Kristy, fantastic. Thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding how the roles of religion, fueled by the idea of religious freedom as found in the U.S. Constitution, plays in the lives of migrant workers in Iowa's meatpacking plants. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Yeah, you ask great questions. You're a great conversation partner. Thank you. Thanks so much.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.